This is the image editor, and it gives us access to the different types of images that we might have loaded into a scene. It's pretty simple and straightforward, but it does have a lot of handy stuff that can save us some work or other things in other places. Of course, a lot of the time when we're loading images into things, we'll be doing it in something like the surface editor. We'd be taking something like an image node, right? And you'd be selecting the image to load an image here, and that's one of the most common ways in which we go pulling images into our scene. However, when images are loaded in to our scene or our objects for textures, whatever else, they will come into the image editor here. As I say, it does have some very useful features, so even though commonly we will load up our images in Surface Editor directly most of the time, there is stuff that we can do here. Obviously enough, we can just load images into the image editor or, into Lightwave itself, just with the load button. If we've made changes to an image, so perhaps, we're painting a texture or something in Photoshop, right, and we've already loaded it in and we try it on a model and we surface it and then we go back to Photoshop and make some changes. We don't want to have to reload our whole scene. You can just click the reload button and that will reload whichever image you have selected. You might be wanting to swap an image out, so maybe you've got a single image that you're using in multiple places, right? You've got it used as the input to multiple surfaces or, whatever else. It's being used in multiple places within a scene. And you're wishing to swap that out for a different image. In this case, you can select an image in the list and use replace, and of course that will replace all of the references to it, which is quicker than going through all the different places where you might have it loaded and doing a swap out there. We can also clone an image. Now this doesn't clone the image file, rather it clones the image as it is loaded into Lightwave. It's just like cloning an object. You don't get a second copy of the object stored on your drive, you just get a second copy of the object loaded into Lightwave, and you can do that also here with the images, where you can just make an instance of an image. If we have a look here at the main image settings for each image, we can see that we've got the type. We'll come back to that in a minute. Color space, of course. We saw in the color space video how we want to have, certain maps set to the correct color space if you're wanting to override that for any given map, and the most common will be things like black and white maps for, doing bumps or normal maps, of course. Then you can override those here specifically. The same again for the alpha. If the image has an embedded alpha channel, you can choose to interpret that in the necessary color space. Often, of course, that will be linear. If the image has an embedded alpha channel, but you're sort of not wanting to use it, you don't need to save a separate copy of the image without the alpha channel. You can just enable or disable the alpha channel here. Or, of course, you can go for alpha only, in which case you get only the alpha channel for that image being used. In other words, the image as it now appears in Lightwave, as you would use it somewhere, is now just the alpha. If for some reason you have an interlaced image, old video, animation or still image, then you can switch the interlacing any which way round. You can toggle the map usage if you need to here, and you can also add dithering if necessary if there are gradients in the image, although usually that's not necessary. And of course you can view any metadata that might be embedded in the image. Now let's come back to this first bit where we said we had the image type still. You'll see that if here I've got a .mov file loaded, right, that's a QuickTime MOV, you'll see that that has changed over to animation, which is of course the only option that is available for it. And thus you see, of course, you can have animations loaded or video files loaded in like this. And of course you can see the little slider that I've got there that lets me scan through a given video file. This is where the use layout time that we haven't mentioned before comes in. You'll notice that now as I scan using the main layout timeline, then we see that the image, or the animation rather, is playing back in accordance with layout time. When we have loaded an animation or a video, then of course you'll see that we get the animation options here at the bottom, which let us basically trim the thing. So we've got the little editing option here, so the in point and the out point of the video, which we can use like this, and which you can see then restricts the length of that and it won't go past it. And of course we can set pre and post behaviors, so as we can tell Lightwave what this video sequence does once we do actually go past the out point or the in point, setting it to loop or to hold or freeze or so on. The other place that we can get an animation is if we have a frame sequence. So you can see here that I've just pulled in a single image from a render sequence, and that's tagged 060. You'll notice that if I take the image type and I change that to sequence, then this now changes, and you'll see that this has become a sequence of frames. Actually, I need to use the layout time because that's what I've got checked there, and you can see that this is now a little video, and that's of course not a video file, that is a collection of still images. It is an image sequence. When you have that, you'll see that the sequence options here open up, and you can see how many frames are in it. You can set a frame rate for it, and of course you can set your first and last frame again, as well as of course using the first and last frame settings here. So that's all great. Let's go back and just go to still again, just because it's nice and simple, and look at the other options that we have. And remember that these options don't just apply to stills, they also apply to sequences and so on. The most useful tab is going to be this one, the editing tab. This allows you of course to do quick, simple edits on your image, like adjusting brightness and contrast and that sort of stuff. This comes in most useful when you're needing to have alternate versions of an image. Perhaps you're doing some skin with subsurface scattering, right? So you want one colour for the top and then you want a red colour for the undersurface, something like that. Now, of course, you can, create multiple versions of an image, save them to disk and load them in individually. But if the adjustments or changes that you are wanting to make are quite simple and straightforward, as in adjustments that can be done with such simple little controls, then perhaps you would prefer to do something like taking your image here, making an instance clone of it, and then you'll see you can come along and start editing the instance. So you would have your regular image. Let's just put that back to its base setting, shall we? So we would have the original image here, but then we would have the instance that we can work on in this way and make changes to like that. Doing this here in the image editor can actually be quite beneficial, because again, another way that we can do this, and you might commonly do it, would be to work in the node editor and use something such as the color tool, which when you plug an image or a color into it gives you hue, sat, brightness, contrast controls like that. Now that's great, and you can therefore have an image that's plugging to something, right? So you've got an image driving that, but then you want to use a tweaked version of the image for something else, so you bring that to there and you go in here and you make your adjustments, and then of course you've got this second version of the image to output somewhere else. The thing is, of course, that this has to be calculated, and it's calculated at each frame as you render. When you do it here instead in the image editor, it isn't, it's calculated once. And once again, if you're going to reuse an image multiple times in a surface or in different surfaces, then any changes that you make to that image that you've done here will cascade through all of those instances of the image that you have used. You can also, of course, go to the processing tab here and add various image filters. The most common ones would be things like blur, gamma, HDR exposure, possibly textured filter. There we have it. That is Lightwave's image editor, the various tools and functions that are built into it, and how we can use it usefully in our projects, whether that be in surfacing or backdrops or even displacements or anywhere else where we're pulling and using images in our scenes.